Phone lines are open. Ask us a question. And right now we're joined by Republican Congressman Bob Latta from Ohio. Congressman Latta has criticized the TARP program since the beginning, saying it lacks accountability. Congressman, thank you so much for being with us today. Not sure if you heard our last caller's question, but he was definitely questioning the entire prospect of bailouts and wondering where his handout was as well. What would you say to the American people who have such concerns?
Well, it's being asked all the time. And again, thanks very much for having me on this morning. But I have people across my district all saying the same thing. They see all these dollars being doled out from Washington. They said, wait a minute, here I am. I'm working hard. I'm trying to keep my business going. And what about me? And how about some dollars out here? So, no, it's a commonly asked question that we're hearing all the time, not only in my district, but across the country.
Now, Congressman, I want to hit on that, though, because President Barack Obama, using the words repeatedly, responsibility, transparency, accountability, that is certainly the direction that we're going in terms of the TARP money that has been spent and the rest of it that will be spent. Does that make you feel any better?
Not really. The reasons for this, when this all started with the financial bailout, the first question was how much of the money were we talking about? The $700 billion they came up with, if anybody would ever really look at that number, it was just one that was picked. At this stage of the game right now, we've probably got about $8 trillion out there, not just in bailout money, but all these other things that have been going on to try to prop everybody up. And on the $700 billion, the first 350, when I read the bill, and I think more people ought to read these bills, not only in Washington, but back home, because the first one's only about 109 pages, and right on page, that was like 4 or 5, when they started talking about what a troubled asset was, we were talking about residential and commercial mortgages, and that was what the whole thing started at. And all of a sudden, the next thing we know, we're talking in the very next paragraph, or about any other asset that the Secretary of the Treasury defines it to be. And that put red flags up to me, and that's when I started reading just bits and pieces that were coming out there talking about, all these other types of loans that could be from auto loans to student loans to credit card debt. And that I thought we were going to get ourselves in trouble real fast here. And so the whole accountability with those, the beginning of TARP and going into the second part of the $350 billion, which I disapprove giving out, and a lot of other people have also expressed that.
But you know what? It might cost a whole lot more to right the banking system. There's talk of setting up a bad bank to essentially do what the first proposal for TARP would do, is get the bad assets or set a price for these bad assets. But I've heard the number $2 or $3 trillion thrown out, not in Washington, but by people who are economists. And what do you say to that? If you really want to fix the banking system, that's what it's going to cost.
Well, you're absolutely right. Those are the numbers I've heard. When you're talking about $2 or $3 trillion, and the problem anymore, I don't think people are being shocked by this number. Today, when you're looking at over a $10 trillion national debt, we got to pay this stuff back. And the thing that worries me is the Americans aren't buying that debt. We have over $3 trillion now owned overseas, about $682 billion owned by the Chinese alone. We have to pay this stuff back, and then we have to make it more and more accessible, you might say, for these countries who want to buy it. And that's what worries me. What kind of terms and conditions are we going to have out there for these other countries to pick this stuff up? Because when you talk about that $2 or $3 trillion, okay, we put in into a bad bank. Then the question is, okay, how are we going to get rid of that? Well, it's going to fall on the taxpayers, which means we're going to have to borrow more money. And as your callers was talking about, and you were talking a lot about a little bit earlier, it's going to fall not only on this generation, but generations to come. And I really don't want to see this country become a socialist society.
So the question is now, are we going to spend a lot more now? It looks like, the second half of TARP is going to be accessed. Do we go ahead and pump that money in now, or should we be changing course here? And what is the alternative? I know, several people did vote against giving away the second half. Are you looking at orderly wind downs where we look and find maybe some stronger institutions and have some more shotgun marriages here? Or what's the next, what would be your proposed alternative to accessing the second half of TARP?
Well, when we first got this whole thing going with the discussion on the financial bailout, you know, it was really almost like a cram down provision, you might say, on us. It was just like, this is it. This is all you're going to get. We weren't having any discussions on any other types of situations that we have. We had Bill Isaac come in and spoke not only to Republicans but to Democrats. And when he was at FDIC back in the early 80s when they had the problems, you know, they were able to clean up that mess and not put it on the American taxpayers. And I think that we've got to have some more discussions and saying one thing: we've got to pump more dollars in of taxpayers' money to try to fix these situations, because, you know, we're not going to borrow ourselves out of this. We're not going to, as somebody else had said a little bit, you can't spend your way out of this. We've got to get some hard decisions made as to what we're going to do here, but we just can't keep spending right now, because, you know, when you're looking at the financial stimulus that's being talked about, and I have a real question if you can call it a stimulus when we have $825 billion there. And, you know, we're talking about borrowing more and more and more. And if we just say that everybody, you know, it's kind of like...
You would agree, Congressman, that the economy needs help in terms of stimulus, and the banking system needs stimulus or help. On the stimulus side for the economy, what would you do then? How much? What do you want? Give me a size. Give me what the plan looks like.
Yep. Okay, well, I tell you, one of the things right off the bat is, as I said, we're not going to spend our way out of this mess. We're not going to borrow our way out of this mess, because, again, both ways we're going to have to pay it back. You know, one of the things that's not being talked about, and when you talk about responsibility, I'm a firm believer in accountability and responsibility. But again, what we have to do is say, is that going to come from the government down? You know, I heard as he was president-elect, when Obama was at George Mason, he said, you know, only government can really solve this problem. I don't believe that. I think a lot of it's got to come from the private sector. And
but how do you get them to act? I know the money is there, but they're not willing to put it into the banks here. And when confidence is so shaken, when businesses are cutting jobs, not willing to hire just because they're uncertain about the future, then government is really the last man standing, or woman.
Well, the problem with that is that what we're overlooking is this. On the private sector, you know, when you want us to say, how do we get jobs? Government does not create any jobs. Only private enterprise is going to create those jobs. Private enterprise is the ones that creates the jobs to create wealth. Government consumes wealth. And as we can keep consuming more and more wealth, it's going to leave less and less and less out there for the private sector. And one of the things that we haven't really been talking about enough of is, and I think that, you know, a lot of the business sector was concerned about when they saw that on the so-called stimulus, that what we're looking at now is less dollars that are going to be on the side of on the tax equation side. I'm a firm believer that we've got to make sure that the American taxpayers are paying less so they can spend those dollars, save those dollars as they see it. That businesses have those dollars in their own pockets. Yes, sir.
Thanks so much for joining us this morning. Unfortunately, we have to run, but we do appreciate your time on Saturday morning.
But by the way, please watch, because Bill Isaac's going to be with us in the 12 o'clock hour. You mentioned it.
Well, I tell you what, Bill, believe it or not, comes from my district originally, so he's a